welcome to this third edition of Europe Calling, and thanks to Felix in Düsseldorf and Ralph and many others who contributed, also Pia in Jan's office to make that happen. So it's the first time we do it in English. So far we had German speaking German. This time you have to suffer from Austrian speaking English, German speaking English, and Estelle Francophone. Actually, yeah, so Estelle speaking English as well. And by that way, we hope that through the internet we can get more European discussion going. And we are happy again to have Jan with us, the famous hero of the European data protection law and father of the first European data protection regulation, which is encompassing this. You will not get rid of this parenthood. And we have with us Estelle and Max, who are both, may I say, activists and experts at the same time for data protection and the fight for privacy and choice, what is public and what is private. But this time we will proceed in a similar way. Jan will start and presenting his child, and after he presented the child and puts his child, of course, as a parent in the best possible light, probably, we get in questions at the same time from the audience. You can switch on later your microphone, ask questions directly, it will be heard by everyone. And also you can send questions through the chat function, or also by email to my office, to the address you received. But normally it should work with the chat function and the microphone. And then one after the other we will hear what Max and Estelle think about this child. Perhaps they will report about misbehavior or problems in the period of pregnancy and how we got into this piece of legislation. So I switch over to Jan, and we hope that the presentation is now working and he can start presenting his child and show my screen.
There you go.
So this should be visible. Can you confirm?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so good evening from my side, and thanks for Sven to put this up as a webinar. I'm still looking forward to more of those occasions, and I'm also quite thankful that Sven invented this kind of communication tool for European policy. Today we want to talk about the data protection regulation, and just as a short introduction, which is a very basic one, I'd like to go through some slides and explain where we are at the moment, and then we are going to talk about that with Max and Estelle and discussing the things in more detail. So I don't know how to go on. Yeah. No. So at the beginning, I think that we should look at the situation before the regulation. That's mostly a question or the debate which went on throughout like the 10 years before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty and the Fundamental Rights Charter with the fundamental right to data protection. In these times, the internet became like a mass medium for everyone and for all our lives situations. It's becoming even more today, but the main issue today, which we see with regard to consumer rights and privacy rights in particular, is that in the online and the digital sphere, enforcement is quite weak. because not of weak enforcement bodies in general, but the amount of infringements is just huge, and there's no coordinated effort, in particular to enforce the European laws, which we have had since 1995 with the Data Protection Directive, and the very different implementations throughout Europe, which leads to very vague provisions also. In many member states, provisions are different. That leaves open a large amount of field for interpretation, and that makes it, of course, for consumers and for citizens much more difficult to get their rights enforced and through to the controllers, to the data controllers, who, of course, just want their data to be transferred and to be used by them, or to made available for their use. And that's the picture which I show here for the moment. Next is that with regard to Europe and the European market in which we are all consumers, forum shopping is an effect which is taking place quite a lot since some years. It means basically that companies, especially when they are somehow not fixed to a certain member state or a certain location, just choose the legal seat in this market which suit them the most, not only due to a different privacy and data protection rules, but also, of course, other rules which Sven is working on, like tax standards, which are still very different. And at least in the field of data protection, there is now the feeling that this needs to come to an end if we don't want that internet companies, for example, can really move very quickly by just switching the internet connection to another computer in another legal environment and putting a mailbox in front of that. So also with regard to consumers, of course, who would like to know which rights apply to them, and who would like not companies to away from their legal environment, this needed to change. There's also, of course, the risk of a race to the bottom in general, because if companies use their abilities to move around and choose the suitable legal environment, at the end, every regulator will get under pressure and will lower the standards. That would be the risk if we are not chasing for data protection regulation, but still leaving it in 28 different environments. Of course, those member states with high protection would be pressured to lower their protection. And also those companies who still apply higher standards in their business models would be under heavy competition pressure to lower the standards in order to be competitive. From these reasons, the large majority in the European Commission, but in particular in the European Parliament, who was pressuring for a single level playing field and for a high European standard on data protection, was pushing for this to become reality throughout the phase of the drafting moment in the Commission, which ended in 2012 in January, when the EU Commission with the back then Justice Commissioner Viviane Reding presented the regulation draft. But also throughout the legislative process in the European Parliament, which took place between spring 2012 and spring 2014. And we wanted to bring this to an end before the election in 2014, because the large majority of the groups in the European Parliament agreed to a compromise, with almost 95% approving the report which I drafted as a rapporteur here, with, of course, quite a lot of changes on the basis of 4,000 amendments. But the ministers of the member states were not ready yet. They needed another 1 year and about 3 months after our plenary vote to get to their general approach. or of our committee vote, almost 1.5 years to get to the general approach. And then from spring 2015 onwards, when they got their agreement right, we negotiated in the so-called trialogues between Parliament, ministers and the Commission on a common text, which then was ready or is ready now since December last year. Since then, translations are to be done, and lawyer linguists are working on the 28 different language versions, so that the Parliament will be able to hopefully approve the final text in May this year in plenary, and also ministers will do their final vote right before. So what's the outcome and the assessment from our side? We think that the regulation in this form is a huge step forward. On the one side, for consumers, and that's the question of today's webinar, how to get the control for consumers back. I think that this regulation will provide for better consumer rights in the digital age. The consumers will be put back into the driving seat, in particular because of better information rights and better transparency. You see these symbols being displayed there. There will be the possibility in the future that terms of agreement will be symbolized also by standardized icons. But that's just one thing. There will be also more rights with regard to knowing what's happening in the logic behind the processing, and also simplified language generally will be demanded. But above that, of course, there will be much better right for access to data, for erasure, correction of your data. And of course, last but not least, but even more important, it will be valid everywhere in the European Union and not up to the member states to provide lower or higher standards. But I guess that this, or I think that this standard which we deliver by the regulation is also a very high one, and therefore a huge step forward for consumers. And that's coming together with consistent enforcement. And that's a point for the consumers as well, because today we have very weak enforcement also, because there is very weak enforcement bodies in some member states. Sanctions vis-a-vis the controllers can be very low. Sometimes even there are no real sanctions foreseen if data protection rights are infringed. In the future, you will see that up to 4% of the yearly worldwide turnout of a company can be a sanction. So that's to be taken serious by every controller in the future. And data protection officers will be put into jobs in the companies. Those who are active already today, they tell us, now my company and my company board is taking me serious and my concerns with regard to data protection, because now it's really about money and not only about ethics or some rules which could be ignored and then a sanction be paid out of the battle box. So, but also for companies, last but not least, this is a way forward. You see that there might be perhaps also companies not being rigid animals trying to get the data of consumers, but also acting fine today already, or trying to even gain with better data protection standards in their products or services. They will be now on an eye level with all the others, because everybody has to adhere to the same rules and standards across this big market of the European Union. Nobody can just ignore it. And that's, I think, not only for the consumer a big step, but also for the companies who now know what the rules are and know that everybody is acting on a competitive eye-to-eye level. And that's, for the moment, my first introduction, and now I'm very much looking forward to the debate with you.
Thank you, Jan. As promised, a proud father doesn't dare to criticize his own child. He has shown convincingly the big step forward. Now we will see. First, I will ask a few of the questions, or call on a few of the questions asked. So, the question here has no name attached, but I ask it anyway, anonymously. Is this still allowed? So, Eric Schmidt. Wurde nun, why is this in German? Was just called as an advisor for innovation to the Pentagon. How credible is it that that companies such as Google or Apple are turning really truly towards the practices of Überwachung, spying, surveillance of the US government? Is there not rather a narrow cooperation? So the questioner is suspicious whether these companies will ever apply your law, if you put it like this.
Actually, they will have to apply this law if they act on the European market, and that's the main and the most important message. Those companies cannot evade the consistent enforcement of the European data protection rules unless they decide to go out of the European market. But in the online and in the digital environment, that's no option for them, and there's also a very weak opportunities to even do that. But of course, if we talk about the common interest between some companies and also authorities and perhaps even governments and the state interest, we have to be suspicious, and we should not always just run after Apple if they publicly announce that they don't want to help the FBI, if on the other side they don't have a problem that our individual rights in certain occasions don't apply too heavily, if they can use our data for those situations. So it's always a challenge to see where the allies of consumers really are, or of citizens really are. But in some occasions, of course, they also, the companies may be helpful in bringing up the concerns of the consumers.
So, and then we have Karin Wittmeier, who asked to speak. I will switch on her microphone now. Karin, what is your question? Perhaps she has just tested the function. Okay, this seems not... So, Karin, please come back to us if you want to speak. Aha. Martin Schmalzried, he also wanted to say something. Martin, can you raise your voice now?
Can you hear me?
A bit louder.
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I don't know.
Better, yeah?
Oh, okay. All right, so I had a question about data portability. The directive specifies that the data that is being retrieved should be in an interoperable format. Can you actually clarify what that means? Because in order for consumers to be able to reuse the data in a similar service, such as a social network, for instance, they need to have that data in a database readable format, meaning SQL or anything else. Otherwise, they just get a list of pictures, a list of comments, but those cannot be re-uploaded or reused in a similar service.
Absolutely, very important question, and it points out another improvement with the regulation, because this kind of data portability provisions which we put in puts the consumer into the position to better make use from its choice between different services, and perhaps also choosing to take his data to or her data to another service. You're talking about the interoperable format, and the regulation clarifies that it needs to be a commonly used interoperable format. So that's clarified in a way that data protection authorities and also other authorities who might look at this and consumers will have the ability to make sure that they are not given a certain formats which they can't make use of.
Martin, happy?
Just a quick follow-up. Yeah, just a quick follow-up. A PNG, for instance, is a picture format that is widely interoperable or used, JPEG as well. But even HTML, actually, right now, when you export your data from Facebook, unless I'm mistaken, you get an HTML format, which is extremely interoperable, actually. It's just that it is not possible to use that data and re-upload it in another service because it's not a database readable format. Meaning if you want to switch to Google Plus with your data from Facebook, you cannot use an HTML document. You have to use an SQL or a similar kind of database readable format. That's what I meant.
I agree, and of course this is up to the interpretation then of the authorities and of the courts to decide at the end what's something which adheres to the standard which we put in, that it should be a commonly used interoperable format, and of course that's to be interpreted from the view of the consumer very clearly, not from the view of any expert or a certain company. But it's also important that we managed as a European Parliament in heavy negotiations to also get in a provision in addition which allows you to request, if it's technically feasible and proportionate, that your service or your product provider transmits the personal data directly to the new service without any hindrance.
So, you are still on Europe Calling, the Green Group's experiment to bring citizens all over Europe directly in touch with the ones who are doing European politics here. So I would now like to give the floor to Estelle, and I'm curious what she will say about this child. So you do not have to be polite, you don't have to be overly proud. You can be nasty, and that's why NGOs are important to us.
But keep in mind it's still a child.
Exactly. So now the question is, how do I switch? Can you speak, Estelle? You should be. Yes. So now we would like to hear your appraisal of this child. So you could start with, in Germany, we give marks in school from 1 to 6. 1 is the best, 6 is the worst. So if you would mark that legislation in the world of best or worst pieces of law, which mark would you give it and why?
Okay, well, that's a bit blunt, but I would give it close to a 2, I would say. So, well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me here. As you probably know, Access and a lot of NGOs working on data protection has been very supportive of the data protection regulation since its introduction as an instrument to bring users back in control, as Jan mentioned. And we're pretty satisfied with the final outcome. For the long run, we expected a lot of things happening. The amount of lobbying against this law has been incredible. But the people negotiating, including Jan, have managed to succeed to have an outcome that provide upgraded rights to users. So there is definitely a long list of rights in this regulation that put users back in control. There is also an impetus for having a culture of data protection to be spread within companies, with article providing element on the privacy by design and privacy by default in order to ensure that companies at the early stage adopt privacy in the design of their program. So therefore, data protection does not come up as an issue of compliance, which could be a burden for companies that they have developed a product and then they arrive towards the end and then they realize, oh, we're not compliant with privacy, well, we have to redo the whole product, which is probably what is happening in most of the companies at the moment. But if, as companies, your employees and yourself have a culture of respecting privacy and understanding data protection, and you embed it in your product, then it's become very easy to comply with privacy and offer your user with the highest standard possible. And that's the ultimate goal, making sure that all the products offered in the European market are in line with data protection, because it's a fundamental right. It's not just something we're asking because we like it. In terms of rights for users, Jan has mentioned some of them, and there is a long list of it, and you have the right to object to your data being used. If you don't want data being used for certain purposes, you have the right to erasure when you leave the service. You have this right to data portability that we just discussed. And now what will be key will be, of course, the enforcement. That was a big issue with the 95 directive. Some of the action that Max took is a proof of that. Also like to redress and a lack of access to redress for users. One of the things we know is that, of course, we can always go to our data protection authority that are here to help us, but a lot of citizens actually don't know that this data protection authority exists. And that's why one important element that the regulation included is the possibility to have a collective right to redress, meaning that organization, like consumer organization in Germany, for instance, could represent you and go and defend your right in courts because you might not be aware of all the possibility for redress to you, or simply you're not a lawyer, you don't have all the time to read all these privacy laws, and you just don't know where to start. But here what's important and what remains an issue for us in the final draft of the regulation is that there is provision that can be left to member states. And this collective right to redress is one of them. It includes a possibility for member states to include it, but it's not a requirement to do so. And that's why we need citizens to understand that this law is coming to a vote soon in the parliament and start pushing their member state to making sure that they apply the highest standard possible and they fight for this right to redress, collective redress, among others, to be included in their member state. So I would say at the moment, even if the child is graded with a 2, it could get higher if member state out of the strongest rules possible. I'll leave it here at the moment, but we can discuss more.
Thanks to Estelle, and of course she's of Access Info, an NGO on EU transparency, interestingly based in Madrid, and has been working closely also on many issues, and we as Greens even bought one of her best people. She works now in our group. So let's see.
Sorry, I work for Access Now, who is a digital right organization working globally, and I'm based in Brussels, but we're often confused with Access Info. So that's normal.
That was a big mistake, so thanks for clarifying. And of course, we didn't buy any of you, and we would never do. Yeah, what do you respond?
It was actually the other way around.
If it would now be a parents' evening, what would you say in defense?
So I think that there is no big defense needed, because it's clear that it should be said that this is of course a compromise at the end, because no EU law will be applied and adopted without compromises between 28 different member states where there are still differences. And what we couldn't achieve, and that's true, is, for example, that the collective redress opportunities are harmonized completely in the regulation. We could put it in harmonized if mandated, but of course without a mandate, so class actions, for example, it's still up to member states to implement that. In Germany, luckily, there is already a law now passed which would fulfill this possibilities. So that leaves up the opportunity also of improving this regulation and the member states' laws by doing those court cases which will be necessary without any doubt, because many of the provisions are open for interpretation as well as, or in the same way as national provisions have been until today and are still.
Okay. Now, Hilda Paschia has asked for the floor, and I will try to give her now access to her microphone. Hilda?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, I have to excuse myself. I have a bit of a cold. I'm not really a specialist on this subject. I saw the documentary of Jan here in Amsterdam, and for me it was good to know about it and how it works, etc. Because that was my question was about, in your daily life, you use all these things like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter for the good cause. You know what I mean? So I thought, yes, well, I know a lot of people, quite some people around me in GroenLinks, that's my party in the Netherlands. They don't use WhatsApp or Facebook because of the reasons of privacy, etc. And that's really now then very difficult if you work in a group together and you're active, etc. And then that one person or two persons, you have to call them, or otherwise texting them, and so I'm really sort of practical person. How do you go on with those things? If you know all these things now, I know via Jan and what I hear from you. So so in daily life, that was my question. I hope I'm clear for you.
Yes, so now we move to help with how to cope with your daily life as a political person and using the web. How to deal with it.
First of all, Hilda, thanks for the question, and also thanks for participating, which shows already that you are participating in those services. And I think that it also it's difficult, because what I think is the most problematic reaction of politicians to those people who are afraid to use services and products because of lack of privacy, or at least lack of trust in the data protection rules. Most answers go in the direction of, okay, if you're afraid about your privacy, if you're afraid that there might be negative consequences for you as a consumer, then just don't go into the internet. This answer is equal to the answer for someone who is afraid to be run over by a car on the street. Then just don't go on the street, because it's just unrealistic. I have to be on the street if I want to take part in the life, if I want to survive even, because I need to get my food, for example. So I trust in society, and in particular into politicians and the democratic procedures to get my concerns on board. And the same should be in the digital environment. And that's exactly why we said we need to take care about the rules which gives the opportunity for consumers to take a decision in a secure environment, in an environment where I can be trustful in the application of the law, in the application of certain provisions which protect me, but also which gives me just a choice at the end to say, okay, I want to be part of something, or I want to give certain data for a certain purpose, but I don't want to be misused, or I don't want to be without any control. Everybody should be able to decide themselves which data they want to give for certain reasons and which not. And that leads automatically to the moment that, of course, consumers, if they have a choice, would also choose together to move to those environments where everybody feels comfortable, and not only half of the society or half of the people. And I think that would be the best development with regard to Facebook and WhatsApp and all these services.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I understand, and I would hope so too. There will be development, I'm sure about it, yeah.
Well, thank you, and all the best to the Netherlands and to GroenLinks.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to, because there are already questions for Max before he has even spoken, so perhaps give the floor to Max, because he has leave us a bit earlier. Max is, of course, the big hero of winning a court case against Facebook, writing a PhD on data protection law, and if I understand correctly, you want to share not only your views on Jan's Child, but also speak a bit about transatlantic issues. And you have already a question here, which I will read before you speak, because perhaps you can already deal with that. So it's of Jacques Caporal, He's with Inside US Trade, so he is really a very good example because he makes directly transparent what his background is. And he writes, I have a question for Mr. Schrems. You've hinted that you will challenge the new privacy shield agreement. Have you made a decision to do so? So it seems somebody is scared. If you don't, who is most likely to challenge the framework via Europe's judicial system? For all the panelists, what do you think the weakest parts of the arrangements are from a legal perspective? There's another one. Jennifer Baker, question for Max. What will you do about Privacy Shield? A Brussels geek. So they seem to be really nervous about you, Max. Please, so now we are curious to listen directly to the hero.
Isn't Jennifer somewhere still, as far as I understand? Anyway, so first of all, should I talk about the child of Jan, possibly? I think it's generally what worked. I don't think it's like Jan's personal child. Possibly, if it would be Jan's personal child, it would look a little bit different than what we have right now. But what the European Parliament came up with in the end, I think in general we see more or less the same level of protection if you look at the details of it. However, there's now really the opportunity of serious enforcement. I think that's really the news on the whole thing. I was really astonished that these 4% of worldwide turnover being like the maximum penalty went through, because this is really huge compared to a lot of other fields of law. But there are also other options for enforcement. We were touching on that already, like enforcement through NGOs. We have options for collective enforcement. This will be very interesting how it's implemented in different member states. But there are other things, like, for example, that you're able to get damages, like non-out-of-pocket losses, so just the damage in your privacy as well, which is an interesting thing because now you actually get money, and that's how you can actually get procedures, because most of the people are not going to sue for just a declaration that their rights were violated, but for cash in the end. And I think that's all rather interesting. Also, the cooperation between data protection authorities, that individual authorities like Ireland can just, say, if you're in Ireland, you can do whatever you want to do. However, in this respect, I would await the practice, because we already know how the Article 29 working party is functioning or not. So it's going to be interesting how these procedures are then working in practice. However, it's like the approach makes sense. Like on the downside, there wasn't really the huge innovation or like the huge kind of change of law that possibly in certain parts we would have needed, because there was just a tremendous backlash whenever there was any kind of move towards more protection. And it's things like, the big data debate, where there was just such a huge gap between what people wanted. We basically stayed with the situation as we have it. There could have been more regulation on profiling, on really algorithmic things like that. But it's a very difficult topic, and I wouldn't possibly know how exactly you could define all these things. And I just had the feeling these issues were then left alone, more or less, and we'll see how they turn out in the end. And in general, I think it's interesting that it's a very diplomatic text in many ways. So oftentimes, I read a lot of the documents, they couldn't agree on anything, so we agreed on some text that doesn't really say a whole lot, so that in the end it's going to be left to the European Court of Justice to decide what it is. And that's not really good lawmaking in that sense. I know that's pretty much what came out of the situation, but I wonder if that in the long term is really kind of how we want to have laws in Europe in general. And there are a couple of unclear issues, and a lot of things are really left to the member states, or just not defined really kind of on the edge in the law. And that's oftentimes, even on the national law, it wasn't defined too well, but we had case law over the years where we kind of had an idea how this is meant. And instead of kind of putting this case law into the law, we more had a feeling of we're going back to the directive of 95, and kind of the case law is going to be lost in a lot of member states possibly, or will possibly need to go to Luxembourg 100 times to really know what all these details mean. And that's not just from a consumer perspective an issue, but also from a government, like a business perspective, because also as a business you want to know what the law is in the end. So I think that's more my main concern in a lot of that. Turning to the privacy shield issue, we are right now kind of starting to look at the text. It's 130 pages or something like that, or 120. I don't know if I'm going to challenge it, if that was the main question, but I'm sure someone is gonna. And I already have a bunch of emails from people that were looking into it, so I don't think there's going to be a shortage of plaintiffs. The main concerns I would see there is, first of all, the European Commission has basically said that there is no mass surveillance. However, in Annex 6 of the Privacy Shield decision, the US government actually says that there is mass surveillance in 6 cases. So I don't know how they're going to square that in front of the courts. I mean, on the one hand, and if you look at the Presidential Policy Directive 28, there are even more cases that they haven't named. The interesting thing in Privacy Shield is that they kind of list all the positive limitations in US law, but they totally leave out the negative sides of it. So that's going to be interesting as well. If someone pulls out the rest of it, which is in US law and which is in the directives as well, I don't know if the Commission is going to be able to hold that up. So that's the government sector of it. Second issue is the whole private sector in the Privacy Shield. One big issue is that the court has said that there has to be essentially equivalent level of protection. Now, the now Privacy Shield principles are basically the same as Safe Harbor principles in the core of it. They're a little bit better defined, but in general, they're the same thing. And they're miles away from European data protection law. Already the directive not even taken into account in new regulation. You basically need 2 or 3 sentences in a privacy policy and under US law and the Privacy Shield to basically be able to do anything with the data, mainly by just defining a super broad purpose, because the purpose doesn't have to be specific and all the other issues in the law basically follow purpose limitation. So I don't think I think if you challenge it, actually the easier challenge is even the private sector than the government sector right now, because you don't have to prove all these details in front of the court. You just have to lay the privacy principles of Privacy Shield right next to the directive that we have right now, and you'll see they're miles away and not essentially equivalent. Last point on that, and that's more from a business perspective, there is Article, I think, 4 now of the Privacy Shield decision that says that data protection authorities have to inform the Commission if they suspend data flows to the US. Which is an interesting thing, because a couple of lines earlier, it says that they're not able to suspend data flows. So I don't really know how this is going to look like, but it's very likely that DPAs are going to come up and say we suspend data flows under Article 28 of the directive. Obviously, this decision foresees that, because otherwise we wouldn't have the obligation to inform anybody. If we wouldn't have the right, there wouldn't be any need for information. And then you will have the same issue that certain countries or certain DPAs are just going to suspend under Privacy Shield, taking into account all these considerations. So you could possibly end up with this, 28 different countries were having 100 different decisions, which is nothing that you actually want to have as a company if you're certified under Privacy Shield. So I think there are a lot of issues like that. And just one last thing that is really funny, it's just too funny to be true. The Privacy Shield principles apply to EU countries. However, the decision applies to the European Economic Area, which is 3 countries more. So if you have a Norwegian guy suing and say, oh, my data can flow under this, but actually they're not protecting under US law, then you already have a case. And it's insane that you see how structurally this is not really well thought of. So I wouldn't, as a company, I wouldn't really, try to follow that and use other transfer mechanisms as far as possible. Full stop.
Yeah, so there were few tough points raised by Max, even if you were not guilty. So were the genes how the baby came across? So what do you say about that?
Yeah, first of all, Max is of course right. This child has been born by quite a lot of parents, and I think that we should acknowledge that many of the provisions are compromises for sure. Also, diplomatic formulations are in the text, but at the end, you won't see any different in any other EU law, because the point is that in national laws, perhaps it's possible to, if you have just a government doing the law with majority, and it's worked out in a legal environment which is usually taking place since years in the same way that you are very concrete and very clear. But if we want to bring into one legal environment 28 different legal cultures, political sensitivities, and then try to strike a deal on that, I would say that the data protection regulation is the most detailed and concrete EU law which I've seen until now when it comes to an area touching on fundamental rights. That's already a step. I think we shouldn't lose the overall picture that here, for the first time in the European history, we are trying to find common rules and standards for an area of a fundamental right, and that is also a step towards more integration. It's a step towards reducing bureaucracy for companies and creating legal certainty also for them, because until now, with 28 different standards, in Germany even perhaps more, it's really a challenge to talk about legal certainty for both sides, not only consumers but also companies. But of course, everything can be improved, and I'm very much looking forward to those court cases which might be necessary, and those data protection authorities' opinions and lineouts which might be necessary for all sides to better understand what we politicians have worked out. But as I said, still I'm convinced that this is a necessary and important step forward. On the privacy shield, which is based on the current directive and which is in general terms allowing for easy transfers of personal data from the European Union to the United States by companies in particular. I would say that Max is quite right on the assessment that there might be, and there are, improvements in the new decision being presented by the Commission, but most of those improvements don't touch on the essence of what the European Court of Justice has said is insufficient in the general or in the current framework, and that is generally touching on legal redress possibilities, not only for European citizens but also for US citizens in the US legal framework, and in particular also, and that's an issue which is coming into play in addition, seen from a European perspective, that there's no general privacy legislation in place for consumers in the United States, and that's still, I think, a big minus when you want to talk about an adequate protection of personal data in that environment, because there's a difference if you have an individual case-by-case decision model, like in Europe, with regard to consumer privacy and data protection rights, or if you do it on a basis of competition litigation, which basically is the fundament for enforcement in the United States. So we need to look into that more thoroughly. We need to debate about how it can be improved, and if at the moment there's no further development possible, at least I think we should talk about limiting the application of these new standards in time and come back to them when we apply our new rules on the data protection regulation, because improvements need to be done, and we need to further debate on a transatlantic standard which needs to be better than what we have been presented right now.
Well, there arrived a few more questions which are also directed to Max or related to the privacy shield. So I first start with Paul-Olivier Dehaene. What about Max starting a platform to help EU citizens exercise their privacy rights? If I understand Paul-Olivier right, he wants you to stop with your PhD and immediately move into helping people, which is great. So then Denisa Novakova, So the first question, well, no. In the context of the Privacy Shield, could you just briefly comment on the main differences of the perception of data protection in the EU and in the US? And then, Max, which hyphens other mechanisms would you recommend to companies except the Privacy Shield? And then there's a last one by Mick O'Neill. The draft EC adequacy decision says companies have to offer right to object, right to amend and delete. But this is not, as far as I can see, in the agreed text. Will this matter at the end of the day? This sentence is not complete. Will this matter at the end of the day? Will the adequacy decision be amended or the agreed text? That was about the Privacy Shield, obviously. So, Max, no, there's the last one, and you can try to put it all together. It's by Seren Kaya, and the question is, how does the Privacy Shield influence new EU data regulation? The second part of the question has been dealt with.
How does it influence?
How does the Privacy Shield influence EU data regulation? I'm sure Jan
probably that's something that Jan can answer. But I'm going to start out with 1, 2, 3, I guess. So, Paul, on exercising the rights, I think there were a lot of approaches right now that like smaller web pages that allow you to, for example, make access requests. The problem there is oftentimes that you don't want to spam companies. So you don't want to have the page that allows you to make access requests at 10,000 companies at the same time, because this is just, misusing the law. I think there are approaches, and I think what would be interesting to spread them out on a European basis. Right now, I get a lot of questions, why don't you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G as well? I'm just one person sitting in his home office that you can see right behind me, so you got to concentrate on certain things. However, that's an interesting thing, and I think a couple of people are working on that, and we have looked into that a little bit as well. On the perception of EU and the US on privacy, that's a cultural question. I think, and you can't even say that the European Union has one specific view on it. I don't really want to answer that too much, honestly. I think it really depends on who you ask and which part of the US you're in, which part of the EU you're in. Generally, you just don't have a general protective law, which doesn't mean that a lot of Americans wouldn't like to have that. It's just politically impossible. And second part of that question was alternatives to Privacy Shield. You have to stand up. Basically, the big issue is if you're a U.S. company, do you fall under any mass surveillance laws? That's the key question. If you do, like Google or Facebook or whatsoever else, especially the companies that are in the Snowden files where we know that they actively participate in it, you under the judgment, I don't think you can use any of these alternatives. However, that doesn't mean that the whole rest of the industry can't use alternatives. If you are a hotel, you don't typically fall under the FISA, the 702 provisions, because that only applies to an electronic communication service providers. So you have to look at that, and then you can basically use the standard contractual clauses. You can use, in certain cases, the legal provisions like providing a contract. So if I book a hotel in New York, obviously the data has to go there. So in these cases, you already have exceptions under the law, which weren't used too much, but which you can use and that are legally much more stable than Privacy Shield. However, you have to see, especially with the standard contractual clauses, there is an exception. Article 4 of these decisions is actually 3 decisions, but they all have this article, saying that if there's conflicting national law, the standard contractual clauses do not apply. And that's the biggest issue you have to check if there is a national law that would conflict with these standard contractual clauses. And you would have the same issue with Privacy Shield, I think, as well. But we'll see how that turns out. I think it was Mike, like the third question on differences between the text and the decision. I haven't really heard about this. If you can send me an email about it, would be interesting. We found a couple of differences already where the Commission has first said that's the fact, and actually in the annexes it's not supported. So that would be interesting. I didn't really grasp what exact, I noted it, but I don't know exactly what I wrote there. If you have an email on that, would be interesting, and I think that is an issue that you can possibly bring up in courts if the decision is based just on wrong findings, basically. And as I said, the last question with the new regulation, how Privacy Shield influences that, I don't really know. I don't think Privacy Shield influences the new regulation at all. The new regulation may influence Privacy Shield, on the other hand. And generally, the law, like the data protection reform, it uses the same words, like the key words in the new law, exactly the same as under the corrective. So this doesn't really change anything as far as I'm concerned. So the question of adequacy is the same, and the application of Article 8 is obviously the same with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and 7 and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that there is any change. However, there's this whole tie between Privacy Shield, the Umbrella Agreement. There may be a couple of issues that come up as soon as the new thing comes into force, but that's possibly too long of an answer. Full stop.
So, you want to come in as well again?
Sure, I can tell you a few things about the Privacy Shield as well, actually. So one thing that was discussed is the redress right for users on case of surveillance. That was something that was promised by Commissioner Jourova when she announced the Privacy Shield. And what's interesting is like Access has a lot of offices in the US, and when that was announced, my colleague in the US were like, oh, that's interesting, we don't have that, right? How is it that you're going to get it? So then we find a Privacy Shield that actually we don't have the right to redress in case of mass surveillance. We have the right to ask a question to the ombudsman, and then she might or might not do something, which makes a little bit of sense in the fact that in practice in the US there is no such right to redress either. I would agree with Max that there is issue with the essentially equivalent. One of the overarching issues that needs to be essentially equivalent with EU law, but also with the Charter. And one of the basic principles of the Charter is that the right applies not only to EU citizens, but also to anyone, basically, in the EU, no matter your nationality, while the Privacy Shield offers claims to offer protection to only EU citizens. And then here is also the issue of claims. The Court of Justice in the Safe Harbor case asked for the Commission to create an assessment, make an assessment in practice of the protection in place in EU law. When you look at what the European Commission has done in order to conclude the Privacy Shield is that they asked letters from the US on what they were doing, and they took the letter as granted, and then they said, that's my assessment. It's not too surprising because the Commission has done that in the past. If you remember, right after the mass surveillance revelation, there is some Snowden document that showed that the TFTP agreement, which is about terrorist financial tracking program, was being abused by authority and being used for other purposes. So Commissioner Malmström had an exchange of letter with the US, and then came back to the Libe committee in the parliament saying, don't worry, we received written reassurance that everything is fine. And that's basically what just happened with the Privacy Shield. The Commission asked questions to the US sent a letter saying, don't worry, everything is fine. And the Commission said, great, I've done my investigation, everything is fine in the US. And what we need to know is that there is a word of games. When the US is saying that we do not conduct mass surveillance under this program, they mean that 702 is targeted, but what is targeted for US law is actually indiscriminate surveillance for EU law, which means actually that mass surveillance is happening. So the Privacy Shield is nowhere complying with the CJU ruling, and there are so many angles where you can attack it that I agree with Max in the fact that I think actually the list of plaintiffs will just queue in front of the CJU to file complaints because there are just so many ways you can go after the argument. I'll stop here.
Estelle,
Are you in the background?
just one follow-up on what Estelle said just came in. Does it even apply to EU citizens outside of the EU? A follow-up by Paul-Olivier Dehaene.
Should I answer that? I think as far as I understood it, and that's going to be the last thing I can say because I really got to run. As far as I understood it, it says data that stems from the European Union. So it would cover pretty much all people. The main issue is that data could come from Norway or from Iceland. or Iceland, and then the word of the Privacy Shield are not protecting it, the Commission decision would have recovered it, which I've looked into was the same apparently on the safe harbor, but basically you just need a Norwegian guy coming up and saying my data is not covered. If these are things that you can find if you look through it the first time, I'm sure there are 100,000 other loopholes we're going to find, and I think that just comes out if you kind of try to push something through in the last minute without really properly working through all these things and really having proper protection. And to be fair, I mean, the Commission had really, I think, 2.5 years now to work on this, and the US hasn't moved a lot for really until this judgment came out. So it's not really that they had this little time, they just so far didn't see it as a priority, and then the last moment just felt they're going to push something through. And yeah, same thing for this ombudsman, where basically you can send a letter. I mean, I've done that under PNR and sent a letter because I was on a blacklist of a flight to the US, and then you get an answer back saying, oh, this is all national security, but thanks for your letter. I mean, this is not what we would call redress, possibly. However, also to be fair, we don't have that in a lot of member states either. Like if I'm an Austrian and the German BND is going through my data, there's not really not even a post box that I can address. So we have to look at that in the European sphere as well. But I don't think that this whole deal is working. My impression is that the Commission was just, until this is struck down by the court, it's 2 or 3 years in, and who knows if I'm still commissioner at that time. That's more the perception that I get from this, but that's really, again, not really what I would call good lawmaking, right?
Max, if I understand correctly, we have to say thank you. Bye-bye. There's one very interesting question to you. We will send it by email if you have to rush.
30 seconds if you have a very short question, I can...
This is not very short. So Max, it does meet your criteria. We wanna see you again, so therefore we may not annoy you too much. Keep on fighting. Thanks a lot, and keep in touch. So bye, Max, and we try to deal with it. In any case, you get it by email, and all the best.
Talk to you.
So I read this now, and perhaps Jan and or Estelle or anyone else on that webinar can make sense of that. It's a question of Klaus Zinser. If I realize that there is a violation of EU law, can I write to the I can write to the EU Commission, and they have to answer within 21 working days. There's also a complaint form. And he gives the legal complaint form URL. As these letters and entries are not accessible for others, would it make sense that the EU Parliament or someone else collects these entries? Are there other ways to complain, as the EU court is most times not accessible or too expensive? Maybe Marx should comment it too, as he once said, he is looking for interesting cases that can be brought to court. So what do you say about this? Should the Parliament make sure that we get access to these forms? I never thought about that. What do you think about it, as our lawyer in the Green German group here?
If it's in an anonymized form and it's just about reporting of breaches to EU law, I think that it makes sense to allow the Parliament to analyze these complaints and follow up to them on their own vis-à-vis the Commission, because the Commission normally is also in the position to ask the European Court of Justice for infringement procedures if EU law is not applied. And my impression is that this is not sufficiently used for the moment. In particular, by the way, also in the area which Max just touched on, national security in EU member states would be one area where I think that the EU Commission could also do infringement procedures and ask if it's really in the national security of the European Union that, for example, or European Union member states that, for example, EU commissioners are spied on by some intelligence services of the member states, or that EU citizens of certain member states don't get redress in front of these bodies. But nonetheless, I think that it's important to talk about how EU law can be better enforced. And of course, there are other ways you can choose. Not only pointing those problems to the Commission, but you can also point them directly to the Parliament, to the European Parliament and also national parliaments, because there are petition committees, for example, who are exactly there. For taking on board those demands and complaints, and then having the ability to follow up to them and bring them to the awareness of the Commission, for example.
Okay, I would just like to point out that if anyone wants to speak directly through your computer, I see now Timo Sackmann has put up his hand, so I will try first to give him the floor to make that a bit more, a dialogue. So Timo, can you hear us?
Hi, I have a question regarding practical design issue. I think it's very important not to look only at the judicial on the law level of this topic, but also on the user who is in need to have a simple product, simple in use, I mean. And often this is given as a main reason against privacy and the privacy laws, that it makes things too complicated, and that users do not want to use such complicated software. On the other hand, you see that digital innovators like Google or Facebook make it complicated to set your privacy settings in the way you would like to have them. I think there's a lot of research about that, showing that it's complicated for the average user. How will you prevent such kind of, I call it manipulation, by law?
Well, it's a good question, and of course, the legislator, the regulator, may not completely prevent that people in society are trying to trick each other. That's also up to the public to raise possible misuse and to blame those who are not fairly acting towards, for example, the consumer. And of course, there's also competition rules which are trying to get away from unfair practices, for example. Data protection rules can't fully prevent those misuse possibilities. But what we did in the regulation, and that is an important step, is to make clear rules and standards with regard to transparency and the language which is used, for example, and the possibility to easy and clearly indicate preferences, to not make it too complicated, for example, to enable your rights, to use your rights, individual rights with regard to access to the consent you are given, or to the right to object which you may give, that there's clear and understandable language, and that it shouldn't be complicated for you to use these rights. That's in the text, and that's, of course, to be applied by the data protection authorities and to be enforced by the consumers, the consumer associations. I hope that it's working out in a better environment. But as I said, I think it needs a critical public. It needs also a critical consumer which blames those who are doing unfair practices. And of course, it needs competition authorities who look at that from their angle. But I think that, for example, or that perhaps Estelle would also perhaps like to get into this question.
Estelle, do you want to join?
Yeah, I can say something actually from just to add a different perspective, because we see a lot of time that actually the burden is put on the users to protect their privacy. But also one thing that this regulation aims to do is having all companies operating in the EU complying with those privacy rules. And we were discussing before a lot of people stop using WhatsApp or Facebook because of their privacy policy, and that shouldn't be the case, because if you like the service, you should be able to use it in the EU because we have data protection rules. So we need to enforce those rules to ensure that people can actually use the service they want and not having to restrict their choice because none of the company operating in the EU are actually respecting those laws. So this will also make it easier for the users, because if as a user my first step is trying to find which product is not violating my right in reading all these very difficult contracts, this is already a first difficulty. So the regulation will help on information on what exactly is protected and what are your rights under those products. But there is also work to be done from the company that have decided to operate in Europe to comply with our laws.
I would suggest now the following. I see the number of participants after it was stable for a long time is going down a bit. I have still quite a number of questions here. I will read one by one and or in small groups, but I would like to suggest that we close the list of questions, so at least in say 2 or 3 minutes. So if you have urgent ones, please type them in or raise your hand. And I'll continue now with the interesting questions which have arrived. So first, Russia and China have managed to build an alternative digital infrastructure. What has Europe missed?
Yeah, I think that Russia and China and their alternative infrastructures show that perhaps building an alternative infrastructure just because is not the right way for Europe, or building an alternative infrastructure because you want to shut down your citizens, your consumers from accessing the information in the online environment is, of course, exactly the opposite of what the European way should be about. And that makes it so complicated, because what we don't want is to interrupt connectivity and to draw borders and build borders at the outset of the European Union with regard to the digital and globalized environment. But what we want is to ensure consistent and clear application of the rules which we are democratically deciding on for each and everyone who is acting on our market, who each and everyone who's interacting in our society. And I think that this is something which can be described as the European way, to allow for things to happen and allow for people to travel and to communicate and send information freely, but at the same time also set basic standards and rules which need to be respected in this environment. And not stopping at the EU border to enforce the laws which we want and set the rules which we want to have, but also to try to convince the global community that common rules and standards for the digital environment is what we are aiming for. And that's also where data protection can be an example with the adequacy decisions. As we have just talked about the privacy shield, I think that the adequacy structure, which is brought in by the Directive 95 already, is a way to get into debates and interaction with other states on global standards.
So then there is a quite different question by Elisabeth Joost. which sanctions do the companies who are not applying the standards have to fear?
I answered that at the beginning. It's a sanction possible up to 4% of the yearly worldwide turnout of a company, or in case of an individual up to 20 million euros. But in case of companies, that means it can go into billion sanctions if you talk about huge internet companies or the biggest companies, businesses in the world. Then this will be a heavy sanction, and that means data protection laws can't be ignored anymore. And that's a very important signal.
Well, then there is a question by someone whose name is really hard to pronounce for German. It's Kardelen Bunaydin. What is Mr. Albrecht, so you, opinion on the Network and Information Security Directive proposal? Will it enforce GDPR, or will the security privacy dichotomy persist with regards to these two legislative instruments as well?
That's an expert's question, but just let me explain. There is a directive on network and information security, which has been also agreed in December in the course of trilogue negotiations, so it's already decided. And the GDPR is, of course, the General Data Protection Regulation, and those two laws, they don't interact too much. The data protection regulation is the framework for personal data in the European Union's market. And whenever personal data is to be processed or will be processed, then this law is to be applied and respected. These rules need to be respected. The Network Information Security Directive comes on the top of that as a basic standard for information security, IT security in vulnerable or sensitive infrastructure. That's in particular airports, water supply, or banking systems, or even some telecommunications systems might be covered by those provisions. And those provisions are on the top, in mainly building up a notification scheme for authorities to look after the better security. I think it's a good directive as a start. It can't be the final word on IT security, that's for sure, because if we really want to build a secure IT environment, then we can't only look at vulnerable systems. We also have to look at each and every IT system. That means each and every software, hardware which is produced out there or which is used out there needs to comply with certain standards, and that means also liability standards. But that's to become. That's to come, and we are, as Greens, pushing for that. The Commission is not very likely that they will present something in near time, but hopefully that can be changed. But let me also say, just as a last word for this, that in the data protection regulation there is also an article on data security, which means there also is a start on IT security in general. You will need to have baseline standards in each and every IT system which is used for processing personal data, and that can be enforced in the same way like data protection rules in this regulation.
So,
perhaps Estelle wants to come in on
please,
that.
Yes. All the time, please simply raise your voice.
Sure, thanks. Well, actually, I would disagree on the quality of the NIS directive. On the privacy perspective, I agree that it doesn't clash with the GDPR. Actually, even the Network and Security Directive have a provision saying that all rules concerning data protection needs to be referred to 95 directive, which will be changed to the regulation. So this is something that we welcome, because data protection standard has to be set in those framework and not in IT security framework. But one element that is very concerning in the NIS framework is that it allows member states to develop security standards that have to be implemented by companies registered in these countries. And this is quite worrying if we see the trend in countries like France, who today in the National Assembly adopted a law saying that if companies don't help breaking encryption, the executive fails jail time or big fines. So it means that government could create standards with vulnerabilities in that would damage the whole network infrastructure. So the NIS is not as bad as it could have been, but there is an element that's particularly worrying in the current debate on encryption happening.
I agree.
Well, then there is an anonymous question, which is quite straightforward. Can you provide a list of resources for services that are safer or provide more data protection?
Oh, we can start a short brainstorming together with Estelle. I think that already today there are quite a lot of services which try to use data protection and IT security as their brand, as their marketing and market opportunity. For example, in the messaging in the messaging market, you can see apps like Streamer or Signal, which build on those ideas of secure communication. You can also see that certain companies try to provide secure or data protection, data security friendly cloud services. There are also even those who try to plan services which may show you the terms, privacy terms, in an easy format on your phone. If they scan apps for you and so on, all that can be found. There are, I'm sure, websites for that, and perhaps Estelle has some hints where to find it.
I think the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a large US NGO working on privacy, has a list of different apps and services that you can use, and it's also rated by whether this service is tracking you, whether this service offers encryption. So it also shows you the level of security that you can expect, so you can make a sort of an informed choice in that. So it offers some of the mobile services that Jan mentioned, but also some alternatives to Google search, some tips also on how to encrypt your emails. This is a service that we offer also at Access Now. We have a helpline that helps journalists, activists, anyone who wants to install encryption. That the installing process can be quite painful, but once it's in your computer, it's quite easy to use encryption. So we're happy to help any users willing to encrypt their email, making the move forward. So there is a lot of NGOs providing both resources. So feel free to just contact us and we can discuss different options. So.
Yeah, then there's even a question which is hard for me. I read it anyway. First, thanks from Joscha Albert for setting up this webinar. Data protection and the use of big data is increasingly an important topic in the field of financial systems and the provision of financial services. E.g., new unregulated actors like fintechs use alternative data for their credit assessment procedures. Sven, is it a topic you already look into? And what kind of discussions are going on in this regard in the EU? Thanks. So I will say a word from my perspective, and then perhaps we have for the first time an inter-committee exchange about it. So obviously the fintechs are an issue when it comes to the Commission plans about retail services and financial services. So there is an action plan, and the question is so far open whether there are needs for stronger regulation. But the Commission is working on it. ESMA, the market regulator, is working on it. And the Parliament has proposed to have an initiative report where the Parliament looks particularly in this issue of fintechs. And of course, the use of big data where you don't need, like in a normal bank, someone who makes an assessment, where also a human factor comes in, but that you are judged according to big data, is of course something where you have much less control as a citizen. If I hear that that more and more actors expect that this will be the future of handing out credit and not a personal relationship, this is certainly something many people will be very concerned about, and it has to be discussed. And the Econ Committee in the Parliament will work on it, and I'm interested what Liebe thinks about it.
Oh, we should do an opinion.
But no more rights for your committee in that, right?
No, I'm just realizing that it seems to be really an issue which should take on board. If you see what's going on, and there's the question already hinting on that some companies who sell microcredits, for example, are doing an assessment in some minutes by algorithms scrolling through public available sources or through sources which they just get from somewhere. Then this is a huge question, not only for data protection, by the way, but generally for a provision of the Fundamental Rights Charter, a very relevant one, and that's anti-discrimination. And I really see that this is touching on a huge issue. The point of, and that has been mentioned by Estelle, of the data protection part is, of course, that on profiling, or Max has mentioned it, on profiling and scoring activities, the rules are not concrete enough at the moment, and we need to get further exchange on when there is, for example, a profile done on your financial credibility. And when you're talking about human intervention and the possibility to test that, and computers doing the assessment in the future, or machines, then of course you also will get in the position, or will see that financial supervision will become far more complicated because if there's algorithms programmed at the end, the criteria for the assessment will be far more complicated to be assessed in the system. So you can assess a financial creditor who is doing criteria for why giving a credit or not, but if you do it by algorithms, it will be very difficult for you to still assess what's happening inside. And that is a huge question in how far we still can provide for effective oversight on those measures and mechanisms.
This is not foreign to financial regulation, obviously. So, for instance, when it comes to high-frequency trading, we have already algorithm testing in some countries where this is an obligation. But it will be dealt with in the Parliament, and I learned now that Liebe wants to do an opinion.
No.
That is
at least I will file a request.
Okay, I'm sure you will get it. So then, I'm Fanny Hidvegi from EPIC EPIC in the United States. I'd like to ask Jan, what is his impression about the European Parliament's mood about Privacy Shield, and can we expect scrutiny action in the comitology procedure? Thank you all for your work in organizing this session. So I'm surprised that even in the US there's interest in European comitology procedure. Many people claim there are only 3 people on Earth who understand it fully. So Jan, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, so first of all, good afternoon, Fanny, and all the others who are joining us from the other side of the Atlantic. On the Privacy Shield, we already exchanged with Max, and I agree to his assessment that generally we'll have hard time to justify that this is the necessary improvement which the court has asked for with regard to the protection of EU rights and to the equivalent level of protection in these transfers. The question was with regard to the consequences to this assessment now. Of course, the adequacy rating towards the United States is done by the Commission alone in the course of the comitology procedure with the Member States. meaning that the European Parliament doesn't have a say on it. So we can only do resolution on it and, of course, make pressure on the Commission, which will most likely be done in the next plenary session. We are just now in Strasbourg, so it will be next month that we are most likely having a resolution on that. We are having a LIBE committee hearing on the Privacy Shield on the 17th of March at 15 Brussels time. So this will be live streamed, I'm very sure. So for all those who are interested, that's the next occasion where you need to get into the internet and get in touch with the exchange here in the European Parliament. And after that hearing, the European Parliament will most likely give its assessment. Of course, it will be heavy fights on the resolution. And that's our way how we get into the exchange on the comitology procedure. I don't expect any member state to make problems in the adoption of this adequacy decision by the Commission. That's why I say for the moment that pressure needs to be high, not only on member states and the Commission, but also perhaps on the data protection authorities to hold the scope of this decision narrow and make clear that this can't be the final say. There needs to be improvement in the future, and this is of course also something which needs to be done in the US in particular, to call for general privacy, consumer privacy legislation, and to make clear that EU citizens, but also US citizens and consumers need to get better rights and better enforcement avenues.
And now comes a question which I do not understand, and you will have to explain when you answer it. What do you think of the adequacy approach of some people? In example, Julie Brill, she's the commissioner who that is. Yeah, but that is saying in that in the US, saying that adequacy does not only relate to a comparison of applicable data protection laws, but also has to take into account the factual situation. In example, French mass surveillance in the countries.
I can take that one. So first of all, in a lot of US lawmaker making this analysis, it's different interpretation of the court ruling than what European has, because the court clearly says it's essentially equivalent to EU data protection framework and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, of course, we can have concern about mass surveillance practices in the EU. It's true that a lot of member states in the EU, and in particular France, has expanded their surveillance over the past years. But then we're entering in a situation where the US is telling us, I won't reform my surveillance because your countries are doing surveillance. So we know that there is surveillance everywhere, but nobody is moving in order to reform those issues. So at some point, it's not an either or types of situations, like both sides have to reform their surveillance. The concern that applies to the US, some of them could apply to the EU, but we have to understand that also in the EU, the difference is that we have a right to redress under surveillance law. We can go to the Strasbourg court, and that's what happened with the Russian mass surveillance law. There was over time with the Hungarian one. There is now the British law that is going to be heard this year, also the French case. So it's true that EU member states are doing surveillance, but we have a right to redress on those cases, which makes a big difference. And then on the issue of essentially equivalence, it's, I would say, a misinterpretation and a misreading of the ruling, which, whether or not it's a voluntary, then it's another diplomatic issue, but it's definitely not what the court meant on that point.
Okay, next question. Laurie Rousset. Coming back to the data protection package, I wish to have Mr. Albrecht and Mrs. Massé's take on profiling. In France, health data has always been subject to particular care as it is sensitive data, but the regulation and the directive includes health data to the definition of profiling. That is to say that this extremely sensitive data will now be collected and used to predict people's behavior by companies and states. This is truly scaring me, especially taking into account that insurance companies are lurking at such data. According to you, what are the risks in the future and the safeguards provided by the data protection package?
So first of all, it's very important to see that with the data protection regulation, as in France, health data is to be treated as sensitive data. So it's subject to additional safeguards, which is on the one side restricting the use of the data, on the other side improving or widening the requirements for the use of that data, but which is not leading to the situation that the data can't be used at all. If there is the necessary requirements and the justifications which are in the regulation met, and that's also, for example, for insurance companies and their work when it comes to health provisions, then these data can be used also in the course of profiling. And that's happening already. That's also happening in France. I mean, if there is an health insurance company giving contracts, for example, or trying to find the right treatment, then only putting together 2 information or 3 information sets about the person is already also starting to do a profile on them. That's happening. But still, I fully agree also that we have some scary developments here. And it can't be that at the end it will be mandatory to be subject to constant or very broad surveillance to get, for example, a health insurance. We need to therefore discuss not only about the requirements for processing personal data, but also for the limits of the use of certain sets of sensitive data, in particular, for requiring, for example, data for the provision of services, or for bundling the use of data for different purposes, and so on. And that is what we need to get into if we are, or when we are now implementing the new regulation and getting new provisions in the member states on sensitive data in particular. So not all of this is harmonized completely. There are some areas, for example, which are still open. Health data and the use for health data and also health research is still an area where member states will have different provisions. And that's the moment where we need to fight, as Estelle was hinting us on, for high standards in the member states. Estelle, perhaps you just want to come in on that one.
Yeah. So I would agree that profiling was perhaps the biggest challenge of the whole reforms, because it encompasses everything on big data and all the challenges coming ahead with that. So I can understand that many users are scared of the potential development. That was the biggest challenge for the legislator, and they've partially coped with this challenge in the sense that profiling has a good definition in the text, which is important if you're going to have exercise the right to redress and challenging on this basis. There is a right to object to certain types of profiling, in particular when it's for direct marketing purposes, which is very important, and that every user needs to know in order to be able to exercise those rights. And then there is a recital in the regulation that is particularly important on profiling in order to understand how profiling works, because sometimes we don't really know what we're talking about. It's the computer assembling a decision, but on which basis is the computer making the decision? It could be quite complicated. So there is a recital that's saying that you can actually request on which basis the decision is being made. And those provisions are really important. Then we would have wanted the right to object to profiling to go even further and not just limit to direct marketing, and that profiling to be prohibited in case of sensitive data, and have much more safeguard on these practices as it's being spread around, especially given the potential harm that these practices can do to your privacy. So for the first time that it was being looked at, I would say that given the pressure that was on it, there is a pretty good compromise on the table, but further work will be needed in court and probably in member state in order to strengthen these measures in the next years.
Thank you, Estelle. We were just checking out how to deal with the last questions. I will read them now all together. I think you need to take notes as well, Estelle. I gave a warning already to Jan, because that is partly a bit complicated. So I start with Federica Boledi. Do you think that the European Data Protection Board will have enough resources to cope with the tasks appointed to data protection authorities? Also, some data protection authorities are very small, and since the role of the head of the European Data Protection Board will not be a full-time position, but an additional task on top of usual work, will this make the position practically available only to a few data protection authorities who have the manpower, so today we should say also women power, I hope, to support it? So, a second question by Denisa Novakova. Lots of people are not aware of the risks in the digital environment. How could you raise digital literacy among the public, mainly among children? Okay. Martin Schmalzried again, and he comes with a number of questions. I start. Question about data minimization. The directive provides that, first, companies may not make the provision of a service dependent on consent to process additional data that is not needed for this. Only data necessary for the provision of a service shall be processed. Ironically, using behavioral advertising is not necessary to provide the service. First, the problem is, in some instances, using more data can arguably be needed to provide a service, but it is not necessarily in line with the general interests, social policies, etc. For instance, using extensive amounts of data does help in predicting solvency and defaults in consumers. But this also has the effect of increasing the inequality between the richest and the most vulnerable consumers, as the most vulnerable, which incidentally are also the most at risk of defaulting on a loan, will pay the highest prices for accessing credit. How can the directive also protect consumers against the use of their data for extensive credit scoring? And lastly, Max Hermann. Jan, can you name some examples in which the European Parliament had to accept a weaker level of protection because the Council pushed for it? Where did you compromise? So, this is all, and please use this also for your last word, because the father usually has the last word. I give the floor first to Estelle.
Thank you. First question on the European Data Protection Board and whether this board will have enough resources. So my answer would be yes, but that's also part of the job of the European Parliament in making sure that they approve sufficient budget for them to be efficient. So I get that back to you, actually. And on the resource of the DPAs, that's absolutely right. There is differences in the size of the DPA. Some have a big team of staff and a lot of experts that help them doing their work. And other are much smaller. There were also so far differences also in the powers that the DPAs have, or even in their independency. So all of these issues needs to be addressed in order to ensure that there's a real cooperation, and it's not only France and Germany who has really strong DPAs that leads all the decision, but actually all countries have enough resources to have well-functioning DPAs. We can properly enforce the regulation across the EU, because that is key for the harmonization that we're all seeking. Then on digital literacy, I think the question was, yes, actually we are part of a network called European Digital Rights, EDRI, who is doing a lot of projects in order to educate kids that comes online, and they're developing a booklet for helping kids understand what privacy means and what are the possible dangers of when you start browsing online and exploring and using social media, etc. So there is a lot of work to be done, because I might be one of the last generation that wasn't born with the internet but grew up with it, and now when you're 2, 3, 4, you already have maybe a tablet or a digital device using with it, so there is a lot of work to be done on that. Then there were questions on data minimization, I think. There's a lot of example on how this can be used against you to do some crates. And an argument saying that it might be interesting sometimes to collect more data than actually what you need. I think here we need to put it back in the context and how is the what you need is being defined, and it's defined by another principle in the regulation, which is the purpose limitation. So if I need to collect your data in order to give you a credit card, then I need a certain amount of data, and then I take only this amount of data needed. I can't collect more data than that because it's for this specific purpose. So maybe as a banker, I would be interested in having more data so that I can make guesses on your further credits, etc. But if you want to do that, then you have to have another discussion, because that's data to be used for another purpose than the one you've been asking at the beginning. And then I know the last question was directed to Jan, but we can see actually from the version from the Parliament and the last version where some part, of course, of the Parliament text was compromised. So there is some important part were not compromised, but there is some issues on one of them was the collective redress that was in the Parliament text, and now it's only possibilities. For instance, in the final text, there is a possibility under the final text to use 2 new mechanisms for transfer of data, which are certification and code of conduct, which were not in part of the Parliament text. And there were one important point on, there was a loophole overall from the very beginning. First, the biggest loophole, which is the article on legitimate interest, that was from the Commission, from the Parliament, that was always in. That wasn't making worse during the Council decision, and it was kept in line with the Parliament view, which might maybe the most limited one, but still a big loophole that is still in place here. And that would be it for me.
Jan, yeah, on the first question with the board, that's connected with the last question, because we have, as Parliament, asked for the EDPB chair, also the board's chair, to be a full-time position. Member states and the Commission, they didn't want that to happen. One of the arguments, by the way, was that then we would build a new agency, and then the member states would need to decide on the seat of that. And that is so complicated that you don't want that to be put to the agenda, and that's why they didn't want to have it as a full-time position, but rather as a board which is chaired like on a rotation base by the DPAs. This is the outcome. That's the compromises you need to do to get it done. But what we did get in is clear words that, of course, there should be sufficient resources for that, and that can be also clarified in front of a court what is sufficient and what not. And that is also applicable to the member states' budgets. Of course, we can't decide as a EU regulator which budget position needs to be taken for a national DPA, but it's clear that member states are obliged to do it sufficiently so that DPAs along the lines of how many people are living there and how many important companies there are have to resource their DPAs sufficiently. So that needs to be enforced, and DPAs in doubt need to also insist on their rights deriving from this regulation. Second question, on the digital literacy, I think that this is the biggest challenge after regulating. to get people really aware of not only the rules and their rights, but on the consequences of their behavior, on the consequences of personal data being processed, on the risks and the possibilities out there. Education and awareness raising needs to be improved, and that's a task which we now need to do for the upcoming years as a priority. I can just say it that generally. I think that it would be too less to just point out one measure. It's a broad range of measures. We are in the middle of a huge transition, and that's not only the internet, but also our whole life is changing, and that's a bigger issue we need to tackle. A third question on the data minimization, and in particular adding to what Estelle already said in this regard, with regard to credit score. I mean, as we already discussed that, I think that it's important to make clear that there are boundaries for discrimination, not only in data protection rules, but generally. We need to get regulators taking care about the vast opportunities of discriminating people in an environment where you are only dealing with individuals and where you will only have individualized products and services, and that's also with regard to financial products and insurance companies and so on. This will be in the core of parliamentary debate, hopefully. But what we have done is that we brought in the right to get more information about the logic of the processing. And I think with regard to scoring, that's the key. We need to get meaningful information about what is the logic of the processing and what are the criteria of processings when these things are happening, because only then you will be able, if you get those information, to then sue unequal treatment or inappropriate treatment in front of courts. Last question, where did we compromise? As I said, on the EDPB chair, that's a one small thing, but of course there are bigger things. Of course there have been compromises, heavy compromises, and it's no secret that I agree with Estelle that the legitimate interest clause is a very hard and heavy compromise we needed to get on board. You saw in my draft report at the beginning that we wanted to cut that down rapidly, because I still think that consumers can decide on their own what they want to do and what not, and that everything what is in the public interest or in the meaningful interest of somebody can be also regulated by a provision voted by Parliament, for example, and doesn't need to be in the hands of somebody to decide on its own, yeah, I think my interests are more worse than the interest of the consumer. But that's democracy. Sometimes majorities are different, and we all know that there's heavy economic interests in processing our data, but that's just proving the point that we need to raise awareness for that. The fact that personal data is a currency, is a valuable resource, and that hopefully we will be the ones paying self-determined with our currency, and not that we are becoming the gold mines or the oil fields of the future and just being robbed by some people because they are chasing their interests. That's a field of a compromise for sure. There are other fields, for example, that we wanted restrictions to be far narrower than they are now, for member states to regulate on, like taking away our rights to access data in the area of security, for example. There is the provision on the data protection officer in companies. We wanted far more cases where companies need to employ a data protection officer. But we are very happy that at least there is a provision now with the member states. They were very much against that. And at the end, last but not least, you can ask Ralph, my compatriot in this fight, about the buzzword. Perhaps you can do a buzzword bingo by any occasion. There are several occasions, almost every paragraph, every article, where there is if proportionate, if available, where relevant, if acceptable, or applicable, or in particular here, or whatever. Those words, of course, lead to the uncertainty and the diplomatic language which Max rightfully pointed out. They all mostly come from member states trying to water down and, of course, of lobbyists trying to avoid strict language, which then as a consumer can be easily enforced. Of course, that's a compromise sometimes. As I said, you have to take if you want laws to pass through at the end.
Yeah, Jan, this is true, but only if majorities are as they are. So
and therefore
that
we need public awareness, and that's a good job that we get perhaps a bit more public awareness now.
Legislation can be sometimes strict. If you read constitutions, often they were written in other times with a stricter version of things. Also, the Charter of the United Nations, if we would ask lobbyists to write such a charter, it would be probably looking like fully of sentences like you quoted them. But luckily, there are moments in history when you can achieve real change. And this can never be done alone in a parliament. It has to be done in a combination of civil society, an enlightened public, and also people in the institution who want to change things. And that's why we will continue with this strategy, building an alliance between us and the parliament and people in civil society and, of course, citizens in order to raise the voice and make more known what's going on. I thank in particular Estelle for joining us here. Greetings to Access and all the best for your work. And we will see each other again, hopefully, because we will continue with this series to keep people closer to what's happening in the EU institutions and help to build a true European democracy, which is our common objective. So, bye-bye and all the best. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thanks to everybody. Most of the participants stayed on, and this time I hope we will have truly a video of this webinar so that people can watch it later as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
So much like a